The chamber of the Concorde did not have a ceiling. It had a sky, painted in slow-moving light by an atmospheric generator 3 kilometers overhead, calibrated to look like dusk on 100 different worlds at once, so that no single delegate ever felt the sky belonged to someone else. It was, the architects had claimed, a monument to fairness. Ambassador Naomi Achebe had sat beneath that fake dusk for 11 years, and she had never once believed it. She sat now in the human delegation seat, third row from the back, because humanity's seniority in the Concorde placed it below the Tess Assembly, the Varanthi Compact, the Silver Reach, and 41 other species who had joined a governing body that Earth had been begging to properly enter since first contact. Achebe kept her posture straight. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen that her knuckles were pale, not from anger, but from the effort of staying still. She had learned that stillness the hard way in her first year as ambassador, when a junior Varanthi trade attaché had referred to human colonies as the training settlements in an open session, and Achebe had felt something rise in her chest that she did not yet have a name for, something that wanted very badly to stand up and say something she would not have been able to take back. She had not said it. She had gone home that night, written the incident into a private log she had kept ever since, and returned the next morning with the same still, folded hands. Over the years, the log had grown into something closer to an archive, and the archive, without her ever quite deciding it would, had grown into something closer to a case. On the display above the speaker's dais, a report scrolled in the Concorde's administrative script, translated into 43 languages simultaneously, humanity's version rendering in clean, sans serif English at the bottom of the feed. Incident Report 7734K, location, Kepler Station, Human Colony, designation Meridian. Cause, mining operation miscalculation by Varanthi Extraction Consortium. Casualties, 41,208. Status, Concorde Review Board to convene within standard decade. 41,208 people. Achebe had memorized the number the moment it came through, the way she had memorized every number like it for the past 200 years of human membership in galactic civilization, not because she was told to, but because someone had to carry them, and the Concorde clearly did not intend to. The Varanthi delegate, a broad-shouldered being named Ulysses with skin like poured bronze, rose to address the chamber. His translator rendered his voice as smooth, almost musical. The consortium extends its deepest regret, Thess said, for what can only be described as an unfortunate confluence of orbital debris and outdated seismic modeling on Meridian's part. We wish to assure the human delegation that a full review will determine appropriate restitution, pending the standard decade of investigation required by Concorde Protocol. Nobody in the chamber looked at the human delegation. That was the part Achebe had come to understand over 11 years, not the insults, which were rare and always dressed in diplomatic language, but the absence of attention. Humanity was a species the Concorde had learned to talk around, the way a dinner party learns to talk around a guest who has been quietly grieving in the corner for so long that grief has become his personality. The chamber speaker, a translucent, many-limbed Tess elder named Vesic, turned toward Achebe out of what looked like courtesy, but was, she suspected, procedural obligation. Ambassador Achebe, does the human delegation wish to respond? Achebe rose. Every head in the chamber turned toward her at once, the way heads turn toward something in the periphery that has finally, after years, made a sound. She had a speech prepared. It had been prepared for 3 days, drafted by 200 analysts back on Earth, revised 41 times, checked against Concorde linguistic sensitivities, checked against 43 cultural protocols, checked and rechecked until it said everything a species desperate to be taken seriously was supposed to say. An appeal to shared principles, a request for expedited review, a reminder of humanity's 2 centuries of good faith participation, a plea dressed as a demand, dressed as a plea. She looked down at the notes on her tablet. Then she closed the folder. No, she said. The translator hesitated, a fraction of a second, almost imperceptible, as if even the machine needed a moment to process that the sentence had actually ended there. Ambassador, Speaker Vesic said, the chamber did not receive a full response. Please clarify your position on the incident review timeline. I don't have one, HFY said. We're done asking. She sat back down. The chamber did not erupt into noise, because the Concord did not permit noise. Instead, it did something worse. It went very, very quiet, the particular silence of 43 species simultaneously trying to determine whether they had misheard a translation. HFY stood, gathered her folder, and walked out of the chamber. Her aide, a young man named Priyansh Rao, who had spent the last 11 years watching her absorb insult after insult with the same still, unreadable expression, hurried after her into the corridor. Ma'am, he said, the speaker is going to want a formal statement. The Varanthi are going to spin this as a diplomatic incident. Ma'am. Priyansh, HFY said, without breaking stride, call the ship. Tell them the ambassador is coming home. Home. You mean the embassy? I mean home, HFY said. Earth. Rao stopped walking. Behind them, through the tall doors of the chamber, he could still hear the murmur of 43 species beginning, all at once, to talk about what had just happened, and none of them yet understanding what it meant. The Varanthi Compact had a saying older than their written language, that translated roughly as patience is the tax the strong pay to the weak. It was meant kindly, in its way, a reminder that great powers restrained themselves around lesser ones out of a kind of noblesse, and that in exchange, lesser powers owed gratitude. Trade Minister Ulysses had grown up believing it completely, and nothing in 40 years of dealing with the human delegation had given him reason to doubt it. Humans were loud in council and quiet in force, quick to protest and slow to act, the kind of species that filed grievances instead of settling them. It was, frankly, restful to deal with them. You could delay a human request for a decade and receive, at most, another strongly worded letter. So when the report came across his desk 3 days after the chamber session, not from a diplomatic channel, but from his own intelligence division, flagged urgent, he read it twice before he understood what he was looking at. Subject: unscheduled departure, human embassy fleet, all 14 vessels, Concord Central Waypoint. Destination: unlisted. Additional note: human embassy staff on 40 other Concord worlds have filed similar unscheduled departures within the same 72-hour window. Total: 340 vessels. Fess read it a third time. Then he called his aide. Get me everything we have on human military capacity, he said. Not the public filings. Everything. His aide, a younger Varanthi named Priskel, hesitated in the doorway. Minister, the public filings are what we have. Humans haven't submitted an updated capacity disclosure in. In how long? Kel checked her tablet. 11 years, Minister. Since Ambassador HFY's predecessor was recalled. Fess sat back in his chair. He had known that, technically, he had simply never thought about it, because a species that filed no disclosures and lodged no protests beyond diplomatic complaint was, by every Concord metric, a species that had nothing to disclose and no capacity worth hiding. It had simply never occurred to him that 11 years of silence might mean something other than 11 years of nothing. Find out what changed, he said, and find out fast. Kel hesitated a moment longer in the doorway. Minister, if I may, the ambassador's statement in the chamber. We're done asking. Legal counsel is treating it as rhetoric. Should we be treating it as something else? Fess looked out the window of his office toward the slow, orbital traffic of Concord Central. 340 human vessels worth of empty berths, now visible among it where there had, until 3 days ago, been ships. When I was young, he said, my father kept a species of burrowing insect in our garden, for pest control. Harmless things. Quiet. You'd forget they were there for months at a time, because they never came above ground unless disturbed. 1 year, a drought killed the plants they fed on, and every one of them came up out of the soil on the same night, all at once, having spent the whole season underground doing something we never bothered to check on. What was that, Minister? Building tunnels, Fess said, under everything we owned. We didn't lose the garden that year, Kel. We lost the foundation of the house. He turned back to his desk. Find out what they've been building, and pray to whatever your family still prays to that it isn't the foundation. 2 jumps away from Concord Central, aboard the strike carrier Tenacity, Fleet Commander Idris Okonkwo-Larsen received the recall order at 0300 ship time and did not go back to sleep. He had commanded the Tenacity for 6 years, and in that time he had grown used to a particular kind of quiet mission: escort duty along the licensed corridors, joint patrols with Concord peacekeeping units who treated his crew with the vague, distracted courtesy people reserve for junior colleagues. Drills that never quite counted as drills, because Concord Treaty limited how large a human exercise was permitted to be without triggering a review. The order that came through at 0300 did not look like any of that. It was short, encrypted twice, and signed personally by General Reyes rather than routed through the usual Joint Command channel. Task Force Meridian is forming. Full lattice authorization granted. You are cleared for Tier 3 capability disclosure at Commander's discretion. Godspeed. Okonkwo-Larsen read the words Tier 3 capability disclosure 3 times before he understood what they meant. He had trained his entire career under a doctrine everyone in the fleet simply called the Quiet Protocol. The understanding, passed down from officer to officer like an inherited grief, that whatever Earth's ships were actually capable of, the Concorde was never to see more than a third of it. Because the moment a great power believes a small one is dangerous, the small one stops being tolerated and starts being managed. Tier 3 meant something different. Tier 3 meant, for the first time in his career, showing his hand. He walked onto the bridge, still in his sleep clothes, and his crew, seeing his face, stopped what they were doing without being told. Set course for Kepler Station, he said, and run the lattice diagnostics we've never been cleared to run in Concorde space. His weapons officer, a young lieutenant named Farida Odieno who had grown up on a Colony 3 systems from Meridian and had lost an aunt in the collapse, looked up at him with an expression he recognized, because he had worn it himself decades ago. The first time he had been told the truth about what his country, his species, had actually been building in the dark. "Sir," she said, "are we finally allowed to stop pretending?" "We're allowed," Okonkwo-Larsen said, "to stop being polite about it." Kepler Station surviving administrator, a woman named Ines Calloway, who had lost her husband and both of her adult children in the Meridian collapse, stood on the observation deck of the rebuilt station and watched a fleet arrive that she had not been told to expect. It did not look like a rescue fleet. Rescue fleets, by Concord Treaty, arrived in soft formation, unarmed vessels leading, medical ships broadcasting on open frequencies, a performance of gentleness that Calloway had come to recognize and in the 2 years since the disaster come to resent, because gentle vessels arrived slowly and did nothing about the cause. This fleet arrived in a formation she had never seen humanity use in public, tight, angular, silent on every frequency except a single narrowband channel that pinged her console with an authentication code she recognized from a training simulation she'd attended once, years ago, and been told was purely theoretical. A voice came through, calm and unhurried. "Kepler Station, this is Task Force Meridian. We're not here to review. We're here to collect." "Collect what?" Calloway said. "Everything the Varanthe Extraction Consortium left behind in this system. Every asset, every claim, every drilling platform still in orbit, and copies of every internal communication their mining division sent in the 6 months before the collapse, which our analysts believe your station's independent seismic logs will show they had, and ignored." Calloway looked out at the fleet, more ships than Kepler had ever hosted, arranged with a precision that unsettled her more than any weapon could have. "I thought the Concorde Review Board wasn't convening for." "It's not," the voice said. "This isn't a Concorde operation." Calloway stared at the console for a long moment. 2 years of Concorde Review Board silence had taught her not to expect much from any authority claiming to act on Meridian's behalf, and she found herself bracing for the same slow disappointment she'd learned to expect from every official channel since the collapse. "Who authorized this?" she asked. "Earth," the voice said. "All of it. Not a committee. Not a subcommittee waiting on a subcommittee. Earth. And if the Varanthe object, they can file a complaint," the voice said, and for the first time, Calloway heard something in it that wasn't quite official calm, something closer to grim satisfaction. "We hear the review process only takes about a decade." Calloway laughed, a short, Surprised sound she hadn't made since before the collapse, and found she didn't know what to do with it once it was out. She watched the fleet settle into orbit around the station her husband had helped design, and for the first time in 2 years, the silence in her chest felt less like grief and more like the held breath before something finally moving again. Back on Earth, in a briefing room 3 levels beneath the Geneva Strategic Command Complex, President Adiz Obi sat across a table from her Joint Chiefs, her foreign minister, and, patched in by a secure relay, Ambassador HFY, whose ship was still 11 hours from planetfall. "Walk me through what happens next," Obi said, assuming the Concorde doesn't simply ignore this the way they've ignored everything else. "They won't ignore it," HFY said. Even through the grainy relay, her voice was steady. "They can absorb an insult. They cannot absorb 340 vessels, leaving simultaneously, without explanation. Right now, every species in that chamber is asking the same question, and none of them have an answer, because we never gave them one." "Which question?" "How much did we actually know about them?" HFY said, while they were busy deciding how little they needed to know about us. General Espinosa Reyes, Chief of the Joint Strategic Command, leaned forward. "Madam President, I want to be clear about what we're actually proposing here. We are not proposing war. We don't have the numbers for war, not against the Compact, and certainly not against the full Concorde military rota. What we have is information. 200 years of watching. 200 years of every diplomatic slight, every trade violation, every unfortunate accident logged, cross-referenced, and quietly filed away by people who were told, again and again, that patience was our only survivable strategy. And now," Obi said. "Now we stop being patient about the filing," Reyes said, "and start being patient about the consequences." Obi was quiet for a long moment. She had been a schoolteacher, before she was a president, in a rural province that had, in her lifetime, gone from subsistence farming to orbital manufacturing. And she had learned early that the difference between a threat and a promise was mostly a matter of who believed you'd follow through. "Ambassador," she said, "when you stood up in that chamber and said, 'We're done asking,' did you mean it as a threat?" "No," HFY said. "I meant it as an announcement. There's a difference. A threat asks the other side to change their behavior. An announcement just tells them what's already true." The Silver Reach's intelligence director, a quiet, calculating being named Desavrel, whose species communicated in part through subtle shifts in bioluminescent patterning across her skin, had been the first to notice something the Varanthi analysts had missed. It wasn't the fleet movements. It wasn't the sudden silence from human trade delegations, all of whom had, within the same week, stopped submitting the routine paperwork that Concorde bureaucracy required for every transaction, as if humanity had simply decided the paperwork no longer applied to them. It was smaller than that, and stranger. 200 years ago, when humanity had first entered the Concorde, they had submitted a technology disclosure, standard practice for any joining species, a full accounting of relevant scientific and military capability, used by the Concorde to assign a species its provisional standing and its restrictions. Humanity's disclosure had been thinner than any species the Concorde had ever admitted. At the time, this had been read, charitably, as evidence of a young, unsophisticated species still climbing toward real spacefaring capability, and every restriction placed on humanity since no FTL rights beyond Concorde license corridors, no independent shipbuilding above a certain tonnage, no seat on the Security Council, had been justified in committee after committee by that same thin disclosure. Vrel had spent 6 years of her career cross-referencing that original filing against patent registrations, shipping manifests, insurance claims, and the scientific publications humanity continued, almost defiantly, to submit to Concorde academic exchanges even as their political disclosures stayed sparse. The math had never worked. She had raised it twice in closed session and been told both times that humanity's academic output was likely inflated for prestige reasons, the way lesser species sometimes did, and that field disclosures were the more reliable metric. Now watching a fleet formation she had genuinely never seen before execute a maneuver that, by her own calculations, required a targeting and communication lattice at least 2 full technological generations beyond anything humanity had ever disclosed. She began to understand what she had actually been looking at for 6 years. Humanity hadn't been climbing toward capability. Humanity had been sitting on it, filing paperwork that made them look smaller than they were, because somewhere in those first tense years of contact, somebody on Earth had understood something the rest of the Concord had never had to learn. That a species perceived as harmless is a species left alone to grow, and a species perceived as dangerous is a species that gets contained. She drafted a report. She titled it, after some consideration, Reassessment. Human Strategic Posture, Complete Revision Required. She sent it to every intelligence division in the Concord that would still take her calls, which, within another week, would turn out to be all of them. Ambassador Achebe returned to the chamber 8 days after she had walked out of it, and this time, when she entered, the room was not quiet in the particular, procedural way it usually was. It was quiet the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has spent a sleepless night rehearsing what they will say and has arrived, still, without an adequate sentence. Speaker Vesic did not wait for the formal opening. Ambassador Achebe. The chamber requests clarification on the human fleet withdrawal, the unscheduled operation at Kepler Station, and the elder paused, choosing words with visible care. The general reassessment currently underway across several delegations regarding humanity's standing. Achebe remained standing this time. She had not brought a folder. "I'll answer all three," she said, with one explanation. She let the silence sit for a moment, not for effect though it had one, but because she wanted to be precise, and precision took a breath. 200 years ago, when my species first stood in a room like this one, we were told, very kindly, that we were not ready. Not ready for full membership. Not ready for independent shipbuilding. Not ready to defend our own colonies, our own trade routes, our own people, without Concord oversight, because we were, and I quote the original assessment, a promising but volatile young species requiring guidance. She looked around the chamber, meeting, one by one, the eyes of delegates who had spent 2 centuries not quite meeting hers. We accepted that, not because we agreed with it, but because a young species that argues with the people holding all the power tends not to survive long enough to stop being young. So we did what every quiet child in every unfair house has ever done. We got smaller in the rooms where it was dangerous to be seen, and we got larger everywhere else where no one was watching, because no one thought we were worth watching. Ambassador, Speaker Vesic said, "Are you suggesting humanity's technology disclosures were incomplete?" "I'm telling you they were true," Achebe said. "The way a locked door is true. It's not lying to you. It's just not required to tell you what's on the other side." Ulysses rose from the Varanthi seat, and for the first time in 11 years, Achebe saw something in his posture that was not quite the smooth, unhurried confidence he had always carried into that chamber. "Ambassador, whatever grievance humanity holds regarding the Meridian incident, and the consortium has expressed its regret. You expressed a decade-long review," Achebe said. "You didn't express regret. Regret doesn't take 10 years to file paperwork about. We operate under Concord Protocol," Thess said. "The same protocol every species here, including your own, agreed to abide by upon joining." "We did agree to it," Achebe said. "For 200 years, we abided by every letter of it, while 41,000 of our people died waiting for a review board to finish deciding whether an accident was worth investigating. I'm not here to tell you we're abandoning the Concord, Minister Thess. I'm here to tell you what happens to a species that spends 2 centuries being patient inside a system built by people who never once had to be." "And what is that?" Thess said, and Achebe heard, underneath the translator's smooth rendering, something that might have been the first genuine fear she had ever detected in his voice. "It stops being patient about the system," Achebe said, "and starts being efficient about the parts of it that were never actually protecting them in the first place." A murmur moved through the chamber, quiet and quick, the sound 43 species make when they are all recalculating something at once. Speaker Vesic raised a limb for order, though the room had not yet grown loud enough to need it. "Ambassador," Vesic said, "the chamber must ask directly, is this a declaration of hostile intent toward the Varanthi Compact?" "No," Achebe said. "If it were, Speaker, you wouldn't need to ask. You'd already know. The way Kepler Station's survivors knew within 12 minutes that their world was ending, without a single formal declaration required. This is something else. This is a species telling you plainly that the account you thought you'd never have to settle has come due, and that we intend to collect it through every legitimate channel this Concord ever claimed to offer us, not because we've suddenly discovered restraint, but because we've had it the entire time, and we're finally spending it on ourselves instead of on your comfort. She let that sit in the fake dusk overhead, in the silence of a room built to look fair to everyone and belong to no one. That's the difference between losing patience and losing control, she said. We've done the first. We have no intention of doing the second. I'd advise this chamber to consider very carefully what it means that we didn't need to. In the Oran Union's capital, on a world with 3 moons and a government that prided itself on caution, Foreign Minister Sale Dorn convened an emergency session of her own council to ask a question nobody wanted to answer first. If the humans have been hiding a lattice 2 generations beyond disclosure, she said, what else have they been hiding? And more importantly, why did they choose now to stop? Her intelligence chief, an old soldier named Bren Kastic, who had fought in 3 border conflicts and trusted almost nothing he hadn't seen with his own eyes, tapped through the report Vrel's office had circulated across 6 species defense departments. 41,000 dead, he said. That's the trigger on paper. But I don't think that's the real answer, Minister. Then what is? I think the real answer is that they were never actually waiting for permission, Kastic said. I think they were waiting to see if we'd ever give it to them without being made to. And when Meridian happened, they finally got their answer. Dorn was quiet for a long moment, watching the report scroll past, fleet compositions, communication lattices, the 11,000-page claim already being drafted in Concord legal circles, rumors of independent shipyards on 3 human colonies that had never appeared on any disclosure filing. 200 years, she said finally. They let us believe they were small for 200 years, and the only thing that ever slipped was patience, not capability. What does that tell you about a species, Bren? It tells me, Kastic said, that we should have been asking who was the child in this relationship a long time ago. The Oran Union would go on to cast the lone dissenting vote against humanity's Security Council seat, not because Dorn doubted Kastic's assessment, but because of it. A species that could wait 2 centuries to be believed, she argued in closed session, was not a species whose patience anyone should ever again mistake for weakness, and a government that valued caution above all else could not, in good conscience, reward the one time that patience had finally broken, even for a cause as clearly justified as Meridian. It was, she would say years later, the only vote of her career she was never entirely certain had been right. The weeks that followed were not, in the end, a war. Later historians, human and otherwise, would spend considerable energy arguing about whether that fact made the moment more or less significant, whether restraint at the brink counted as strength or simply as the absence of a fight humanity had never particularly wanted. What happened instead was smaller and, in its way, more unsettling to the Concord than any battle could have been. Humanity did not attack the Varanthi Compact. It did something the Compact's own legal division had never anticipated a member species would have the standing, the evidence, or the audacity to do. It filed suit. Not a diplomatic complaint, routed through the years-long channels the Concord had built specifically to exhaust the patience of species who tried to use them, but a formal claim before the Concord's own arbitration court, supported by 200 years of meticulously documented violations that human analysts had, it turned out, been quietly cataloging the entire time. Every delayed trade concession, every dismissed grievance, every regrettable accident involving human colonies that had never received a full accounting. The claim ran to 11,000 pages. It named 43 separate incidents across 180 years. It requested, alongside financial restitution, something the Concord's arbitration court had never once been asked to grant to a junior species, an independent review of whether humanity's provisional restrictions had ever been justified by anything other than the convenience of the species imposing them. Dessa Vrel's report had, by then, circulated through enough of the Concord's intelligence community that when the human filing landed, no delegation was fully surprised by its scope, only by its precision. It read, one analyst noted privately, like the work of a species that had spent 2 centuries building a case it fully expected to one day need. The Varanthi Compact settled 11 months later, not because they believed they would lose. Varanthi legal counsel remained confident in their position for most of that time, but because Ulysses, watching the case unfold, made a calculation of his own. A species capable of the kind of restraint humanity had shown, capable of quietly building an 11,000-page case over 2 centuries instead of simply retaliating when it had. By every private intelligence estimate now circulating through 6 species defense departments, more than enough capability to retaliate. Was not a species you wanted to discover exactly how patient it could still be. Before the settlement, there was a hearing, and before the hearing, there was a witness list, and near the bottom of that list, ranked below ambassadors and analysts and legal counsel who had spent careers preparing for exactly this moment, was a name nobody in the Concord's arbitration court recognized. Ines Calloway, civilian administrator, Kepler Station. She had not wanted to testify. She told HFY as much over a secure relay call 2 weeks before the hearing. Her voice flat in the particular way grief goes flat once it has been carried long enough to stop sounding like grief at all. I don't have anything to add to 11,000 pages, Calloway said. Your lawyers have the seismic logs. They have the internal Varanthi communications. They don't need me standing in a room describing what it sounded like. They don't need it, HFY agreed. The court does. The Concord's arbitration chamber was smaller than the main chamber, built for precision rather than spectacle. Its walls a neutral gray that no species could claim as home. Calloway sat in the witness stand under lighting calibrated to show no shadows, which she found, absurdly, the hardest part. She had grown used to grief that hidden corners, and here there were none. Varanthi counsel, a sharp, careful advocate named Rel Ashen, rose for cross-examination after Calloway's account of the evacuation, the 12 minutes between the first seismic warning and the collapse, the names of the dead she still read aloud every year on the anniversary, because she had promised herself she would never let the number replace the people. Administrator Calloway, Ashen said not unkindly, you are, by your own testimony, not a seismologist. You are not an engineer. Is it not true that your assessment of the consortium's culpability is, at its core, an emotional one rather than a technical one? Calloway looked at the advocate for a long moment before she answered. Yes, she said. It's emotional. I lost my husband and both of my children in 12 minutes because a mining consortium decided a decade-long review was an acceptable answer to give the people who survived them. I'm not going to pretend that isn't emotional. But you asked your own engineers, in an internal memo dated 4 months before the collapse, whether Meridian's colony shielding could withstand the extraction schedule you'd approved. Your engineers said no. That memo is technical. I've read it 11 times. It doesn't need my grief to be true. My grief is just what's left over after nobody who could read that memo decided to act on it. The chamber was silent. Ashen did not have a follow-up question ready. And for the first time in the proceedings, the presiding Concord magistrate, a being who had sat through 4 decades of arbitration without visible reaction to anything, made a note that observers later described as unusually deliberate. Calloway was not, in the end, the reason the compact settled. The 11,000 pages did that work on their own. But HFY would say, years afterward, that Calloway's testimony was the moment the arbitration court stopped treating the case as a dispute between institutions and started treating it as what it had always actually been, an accounting long overdue of what patience had cost the people who'd been asked to practice it. On Earth, the news of the settlement reached most people the way important things usually did, in fragments on screens between other errands. Priyansh Rao watched it break on a public feed in a transit station in Lagos, on his way home for the first time in 3 years, and found himself standing still in the middle of the platform while the crowd moved around him. He had expected, somehow, to feel triumphant. He had spent 11 years as HFY's aide, watching her absorb every slight the Concorde offered with the same unreadable patience, and some part of him had assumed that when it finally broke, it would feel like winning. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like the particular exhaustion that comes after holding a held breath for so long that letting it out doesn't bring relief, only the slow, uncomfortable awareness of how long you'd actually been holding it. An older woman near him, watching the same feed, said quietly to no one in particular, 41,000 people, and it took that for anyone to listen. Rao didn't answer her, because he didn't have an answer that wasn't also an accusation against everyone, including himself, who had spent a career believing patience was the only currency humanity was allowed to spend. He thought about the 11,000-page claim, about the 200 years of quiet cataloging that had gone into it, generations of analysts and diplomats and engineers who had done their small, unglamorous part without ever knowing whether it would matter, on the chance that someday someone would need exactly what they'd built. He thought about his own daughter, 4 years old, who would grow up in a Concord where Earth had a seat at the table not because it had finally been granted permission, but because it had finally stopped waiting for permission to matter. He didn't know yet whether that was a better world to raise her in or simply a different one. He suspected it would take longer than his own lifetime to be sure. He caught his train. On the ride home he drafted and then deleted for different messages to HFY, before settling on one line that felt honest enough to send. I hope it was worth what it cost us to get here. Her reply came an hour later, brief, the way her replies always were. It wasn't. Nothing that costs 41,000 people is worth it. But it's what we have, and we're going to make sure it counts for something. Because the alternative is letting it have cost us for nothing. HFY stood again in the chamber 6 months after her return, on the day the Concord Standing Committee voted, for the first time in humanity's 200-year membership, to grant Earth a full seat on the Security Council. The vote was not unanimous. 2 delegations abstained, and one, a small, proud species called the Orcs Union, historically allied with the Varanthi, voted against on principle, arguing that admitting humanity's full standing would only validate what they called coercive diplomacy. HFY listened to the objection, without visible reaction. When it was her turn to speak, she did not gloat, and she did not apologize. I understand the concern, she said. Truly, a species that spent 2 centuries being patient and then stopped is a frightening thing to grant power to. I would be worried too, if I thought that was what happened here. Then what had happened, Ambassador? The Orcs delegate asked, not unkindly. We didn't stop being patient, HFY said. We stopped being patient about being unheard. Those aren't the same thing. My species is still, by nature, slow to anger and slower to act on it. You don't build a 200-year case if you're impulsive. You build it if you're the kind of people who'd rather win once completely than win small 100 times and still be doubted at the end of it. She looked out at the chamber, at the fake dusk still crawling slowly overhead, calibrated for fairness it had never actually delivered. Ask yourselves what it means that it took 2 centuries and 41,000 deaths before we were finally believed, she said. Ask yourselves whether patience like that is a threat, or whether it's the most patient people in this room simply refusing, one final time, to be told they weren't ready. Years later, when the incident was taught in Concord academies as a formative case study in first contact diplomacy, filed, with a certain grim irony, under the heading Underestimation Risk, historians would return again and again to a single detail that seemed, on its surface, almost too small to matter. It was not the fleet withdrawal. It was not the 11,000-page claim, nor the Varanthi settlement, nor even the Security Council seat that followed. It was the moment in the chamber, 8 days into the crisis, when Ambassador Naomi HFY had been asked to explain what had changed, and had answered with 3 words that every school child in the Concord's diplomatic academies would eventually be required to memorize, not because they were clever or because they were dramatic, but because they were, historians agreed, the most honest 3 words any species had ever said to the Concord about itself. We're done asking. Not we demand. Not we will fight. Just an ending, stated plainly, by a species that had spent 200 years being told to wait its turn, and had finally, quietly, stopped believing that the turn was ever coming unless it stopped being asked for. No generation, in the Concord or on Earth, would ever forget the moment humanity finally lost its patience. What surprised everyone? In the end, the Varanthi, the Silver Reach, the Orcs Union, even some of humanity's own historians looking back, was how little noise the moment actually made. There was no fleet battle to name a memorial after, no single decisive strike that could be replayed in Academy simulations for its tactical brilliance. There was a folder closed instead of opened, a withdrawal instead of an advance, a filing 11,000 pages long, that had taken 2 centuries to write and less than a year to end an argument no diplomat had ever managed to win with speeches alone. Later generations of Concord officers, trained to recognize the signatures of coming conflict, the fleet buildups, the border incidents, the inflammatory rhetoric, would study the Meridian crisis specifically because it had none of them, and would come away from the study unsettled in a way that louder crises never quite managed. On Earth, the anniversary of Ambassador Achebe's return was not, in the end, marked with parades. It became, instead, a quieter kind of day. Schools taught the 11,000 pages not as a triumph, but as a debt, a reminder of exactly what 2 centuries of being unheard had cost before anyone finally listened, and a warning against ever again mistaking someone's patience for the absence of a case being built. Inez Calloway read 41,000 names aloud every year on Meridian's own anniversary, a tradition that outlived her, then outlived the people who'd known her, carried forward by administrators who had never met the dead but understood, in the particular way institutions sometimes manage to remember what individuals eventually forget, that the names were the reason any of the rest of it had mattered at all. And in the Concord's diplomatic academies, student after student, generation after generation, would be asked the same closing question at the end of the Meridian case study. The one Speaker Vesik's successor added to the curriculum personally, having sat in that chamber and watched a locked door open just wide enough to show what had been waiting behind it the whole time. What does it cost to civilization, the question read, to make patience the price of being believed? And what does it cost that civilization when the bill finally comes due? No one had ever written a fully satisfactory answer. Most students, over the years, simply wrote the same 3 words the ambassador had once said in a chamber built for a sky that belonged to no one, and left it at that, because there had never really been a better answer than the truth, stated plainly, by people who had finally stopped waiting to be heard. We're done asking,